Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Cheyenne Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Cheyenne Hills at CheyenneHills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
We are across the street and around the world, Cheyenne Hills.
Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. And Nathan, thank you for being here. But there's also another voice that we'll see. I don't know if we'll get to see his face, but Casey. So you want to say hi, Casey?
Hi, Casey.
Hi, Casey.
Oh.
Hi, Casey is he's on the sound. He always makes this all happen. But Casey is part of our Young Guns group that is going through a kind of a disciple. We do all kinds of things. We did soteriology out of
Sperry Schaefer.
Thank you, Louis Sperry Schaefer's systematic theology, and then now we're going through J.I. Packer's Knowing God.
That's great.
It's been a rich conversation, and the thing I keep telling these guys, this is a better education in some ways than going to seminary, because seminary is all lecture.
Right.
This, we get to read a book and discuss these things about God.
Right.
So here's a J.I. Packer quote to kick this thing off.
Oh, fun.
Knowing God. Okay, knowing God is a relationship calculated to thrill a man's heart.
Oh.
I like that.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that's one of those, a different person has called that, it sounds like an oxymoron, but a hedonistic Christianity.
Okay.
And what he's saying is, when you are so overwhelmed with the love of God, you don't want to do certain things.
And that's the first chapter. It was like, if you know God, if you could delve into the depths of the knowing God and who He is, it would so consume you, and you'd be so caught up in this I don't know, thrill of who God is and that He knows your name, which is amazing. It just soothes the soul, and it takes you out of any problem you have. You say, well, knowing God. So, you might on the surface say, that sounds a little pie in the sky. But I'll tell you, when you dive in and get in his brain, so to speak, it's pretty edifying.
That's right.
Do you have a takeaway from knowing God, Casey, that kind of struck you?
Well, honestly, one of the things is we're just getting out of this sermon series with Brian Noel's story.
Right.
And one of the things he talks about is he was in this position where when he finally accepted that after 7+ suicide attempts, each one of which had been foiled or failed, sometimes kind of like quasi-miraculously, he, finally submitted and said, God, I know you're there, and I know you're doing this. I give up. I'm yours. And when he did that, he said the first thing that happened was was filled with this intense hunger to get to know this God who he grew up with, because he grew up in Christian circles, but he just never really, he uses the term, it's kind of a popular thing to say, it's like he knew all about Kobe Bryant, but he didn't know Kobe Bryant. But with our Savior, we have the ability to, even though he was here walking around on earth 2,000 years ago, to still know him as well as we know anyone who's walking around with us today, any of our family.
Oh, that's so good.
And when he just lights up when he says it too. It's just the most amazing.
Well, that's exactly how J.I. Packer phrased it. He said, when a person realizes that their main duty here on earth is to know God, most everything else falls into place of its own accord. Yeah. Because somehow we are now changed because of the not only knowing God, but then the actual pursuit of knowing God. Yeah. We wind up changing.
Well, and to go to the Brian story, he's in prison today. He's served 11 years, and I think his sentence is somewhere in the 35-year range. It's quite a sentence. Oh. But he was so thrilled to finally be able to get to know this Savior who he professed, and it's an amazing thing. It's like, wow, it seems to transcend all of his circumstances just to know God. So let me just launch this little bit. I think, so I've done some different. We did these discovery groups, which basically you have to be an agnostic, an atheist, or a skeptic to get in this group. Okay, I've done some of those in the past, and basically you just field questions. Okay,
fascinating.
Yeah, it was an amazing thing. I probably should do it again. It was really good. But here's what we learned as we went through this process: to answer most questions, if you have a good handle of the attributes of God, and you would know God, But knowing the attributes answered a lot of the questions, if not all of the questions, that you think, okay, I don't have an answer for that, but it's like, okay, well, let's go to an attribute of God, and it answers it. So here's a for example. Why would a good God allow all the people in the Old Testament, the Israelites, to kill all the people in the Old Testament, right? Just destroy them.
Right.
Why would a good God do that? It's like, okay, well, first of all, let's start with his attribute, and God said God is love. So my starting point is God is love, and he has a reason. I may not understand that reason. Now, because of archaeology, because of other history, because of other sources, we know that those people in that land were very pagan. Their kids were pagan. Their wives were pagan. They did child sacrifice to appease their gods. They would go and have sexual intercourse with their prostitutes at the temples. So they were loaded with the paganism of, and God said, okay, I've had enough with you. I'm sure he'd given them plenty of time. And the one thing I said is, listen, I'm arguing from silence here, but there was another nation that was very pagan. That was Nineveh. And God sent Jonah, and because of his love, to warn them, if you don't change, here's what's going to happen.
Right.
Well, they repented and they changed. And that's the one we hear about. Yeah. Are you for sure that God didn't send a similar kind of message to each one of these nations? They just disregarded him? Because here's my starting point is this: God is love, and yes, he is also just. And but that's the starting point. So to know God is to know this is who he says he is. And so whatever happened, I have it bathed in this, like, well, God is love. And so whatever they did, it must have been pretty awful.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one of those where I was looking for the specific passage, I believe it's in Deuteronomy, where God was very, very clear that when he sent people in to destroy the Canaanites, which is where you're going there, he literally had held his hand of wrath for centuries, trying to help them come to Christ, come to righteousness. Right. And so he had stayed his righteous hand because of his love. No. His attribute is not diminished even by that particular story. And so when we look at that, knowing God and all of the questions, I think that's a very fascinating way to start the conversation. What are some of the misconceptions people have from not knowing God?
That's exactly right.
Because that's really what we're facing as a society today.
That's exactly what we're facing. If you have the starting point, like I think the other one is this: God is just. That's terrifying. Yeah. When you realize he is perfect in his justice, he can't. I think I said this just last week. He can't wink at our generation, knowing that he destroyed centuries past other generations that were steeped into sin. It's like he is just, and that's a terrifying thing for me. It's like he has a saturation point. Right. His wrath will not be suppressed forever. And it's like we just keep poking and poking and poking. And it's like those of us that are preaching this are saying, God is love. That's certainly true, but he's also just.
Well, because you don't. Well, and if you don't understand, if you don't take a look at the justice and the retributive nature of that justice, and the fact that wrath, which can be a loaded word if you don't understand it, doesn't have our irrational anger, wrath. Mm-hmm. His wrath is retributive of the unholiness of people, which is that justice. It's the fulfillment of that justice. But if you can't understand that, and you don't have a little bit of what Pastor Galen was talking about, that fear, which is one of the things, like, I don't like the idea of being afraid of God. It's like, well, then you're not going to understand completely, because he is so big, and his wrath against basically what we have become as people because of the original sin through Adam, what's been imputed on us in our nature and the way we behave just from birth, is in such a way that a just God should scare us, but not scare us into acting well, but scare us so that when we realize that we have this ability through Christ, that because he's also love, he created a way to avert his own perfect justice through our faith, because he created a system of blood sacrifice, and then he fulfilled that with his own lifting up his own hand, as Isaiah talked about.
Yeah, right.
And then like realizing that's the realization is grace. And what J.I. Packer describes about that, he says, if you haven't been kind of, and he didn't say, this isn't verbatim, if you haven't been like lifted up off the ground by the swelling understanding of grace, then you might not have completely got it.
Man, Galen, I feel like we need to cue the invitation music and just all sing "Just as I Am." That was
no
good.
kidding, that's good. That's really good.
But you're absolutely right, because a perfectly righteous God who loves the people that have also been offended by your sin. Yeah. And so his justice is even an aspect of that holiness, that righteousness, and indeed his love. Would it be just if in society someone commits a murder, every murderer is automatically let free? You allow them to go free and never pay a consequence of that sin. And here's where God's love comes in as a result of his justice. We are all deserving of punishment, but what he does is he then takes that punishment upon himself. Right. So to truly know God, number one, is to know that someone way bigger and better than you has reached down in his mercy and grace and loves you. And then secondly, that he took upon himself everything bad that you've ever done. And when you get to know God in all of his perfection and righteousness and all of his love and all those things, how can one not respond with anything less than genuine, honest to goodness love? Yeah. And so it's extraordinary. That's why I appreciate this particular topic. That's one of the things too I know J.I. Packer was getting at. When you know God, the people who know their God become quite different as a result. One of the things, in Casey, I'm going to steal your thunder a little, and I actually preached this, and I didn't give Casey credit probably, but I got it when he was talking about this. But remember when we were talking about love and justice, and they don't mix together and mingle together? You were talking about that. Yeah. I stole it from you this last sermon. I don't know if you recognize that.
I recognize a part of it. I think you stepped up from where I had been and took it the step further that I hadn't gotten to, which I was looking at saying that the things... I was trying to think. I'm a very visual person. I'm a visual artist. Communications is how I make my living, and how I tell stories, how I perceive the world. So I always try to think of some kind of visual picture to put in things, which doesn't always work, especially when you're trying to do things like the triune Godhead is like.
No man,
try to do steam and water.
It's hard to visualize that one.
Right. So, but the point is, so I was trying to think of how this would work, is how the love and the justice have to coexist simultaneously, both perfect, but. Trying to see whether it's two edges of the same sword, but the edges, they aren't mixed into the way, and then the way Galen took it was that they don't mix in the middle and become a gray area. Yeah, they're both perfect and absolute in what they are, but they can be complementary. And I think that's the thing that people look at when we get into the apologetics of modern day. Is they're like, well, if he's a good God, he can't hurt people.
It gets all this mushy. So like if you pick one color, let's say of God's justice, let's say that's blue, I don't know, and then his love is red. And if you mix those together, right, that makes a different color,
purple.
But it's a royal thing. You could actually preach that, but it's like God's not that way,
right?
You mix the blue and the red with God, they stay blue and red. He is perfect in his love.
Perfect.
And he's perfect in his justice. Yeah. And that caused problems.
Right.
Because within the Godhead, within himself, there's a problem. How can he give us this any kind of grace or any kind of a second chance? Well, he made a way in between there. Grace is not an attribute of his. Right? That is an attribute of God to be like omnipresence. He's everywhere all at once. Right. Omnipotence, all powerful. With some others that we have. Love and justice, goodness. Those are things. Faithfulness. They are immutable attributes. Right. Okay. Grace is something that's like, it's right in between love and justice. And he's given us this grace. But to you guys' point, what Casey was saying is that the way that he had to do that, there had to be a perfect sacrifice. This is his own rules. Yeah. It had to be a perfect sacrifice. Someone live a perfect life, perfect sacrifice to pay for the penalty of sin so that he could exercise his grace and withhold his wrath.
Right.
His wrath towards sin was justice.
Yeah. Because he can't change his mind. He doesn't change his mind. Or
his nature.
Even when we are less, he is still faithful because he can't be other than what he is.
Right.
And so if he is both just and love, he can't forgo his justice in order to fulfill his love, but he can, because he's brilliant and omnipotent, and he created galaxies and sunrises and all those amazing things, and our nervous system, for goodness sake, our nervous system.
Right, exactly.
Sorry, I'm getting excited, but because he can do that, he can also, from the moment that the serpent started talking to Eve, could have a plan for how I'm going to get it back. The angels are going to be confused when he doesn't drop death because of this.
It's a good
he
point.
is going to die. There's going to be death, and there's going to be life later, and it will all fit perfectly into my nature. And that's like you're saying, grace is a secondary attribute of his love to satisfy his justice because of his love for us, because of what we did. A lot of that is because of what we did. We caused him. Not that's a fallacy. Because of our actions, there was a need for a way to have that retribution and that justice fulfilled. And that's, again, so one of the things he does, he sets down a law, and he says, I want to set some precedents. Blood is life. Blood is the sacrifice. And so when people look at that, they think, well, that's kind of archaic. It's like, if he didn't set up that precedent, that blood is the covering, blood is the way that we're atoning for this, then he can't set up and, then sending Isaac and Abraham up to the mountain. I feel like the whole Old Testament is a big description. I'm trying to say. It was building a model, a sculpture of what Christ would be doing, so that when it came, we wouldn't miss it.
That's right. That's good. That's a great point, especially coming out of that Old Testament. Is kind of what J.I. Packer said on the subject, that all that we know of knowing God, because he's so far above us and everything else, all that we can even know of knowing God is because of his initiative in letting us know about him. In his revelation of himself through specific revelation, the Bible, and then of the general revelation, the world around us.
Let me give another quote here. We can kind of spring off. It says, this is J.I. Packer, "To know that nothing happens in God's world apart from God's will may frighten the godless, but it stabilizes the saints." And I just think it's cool to say, even I think there was a reason that people have trouble with God is because things don't go the way that it's like, well, if he's a good God and a loving God, he would definitely grant me, like Santa Claus would, he would grant me my goodies. Okay, well, he didn't grant me my goodies. In fact, some really bad things happened. Maybe a parent left them, or maybe they had some abuse of some kind, and it's like, okay, where is God in all of those things? And those are hard things to get our heads around. But but to say that God has a will and God can, just because he's all powerful doesn't mean he's going to usurp this whole idea that we live in a fallen, broken world. He's going to come and rescue us from that, but he doesn't keep us from every bump and bruise. That would not be free will, would not be able to exist in there.
Yeah.
And he desires for us to know him out of our own free will. And some people say, the heck with it. He's not, I'm going to be God and not him, because I don't like the way he runs things. I don't like his view on morality. It's like, well, that's your free will to do that.
Yeah. That gets right into the conversation we often have on these podcasts together, as we try to make sense of the world around us.
Yeah.
God has a plan. God created everything in his good order. And J.I. Packer, I think he phrased it kind of in the direction of, we would be very cruel to ourselves if we tried to understand the world, but didn't try to understand the one who created the world.
That's good.
And so when we understand how he created things, and literally in our passion and our pursuit of knowing him, we begin to actually truly know what is in us and how we interact in the world. It all stems from knowing God, and his revelation of himself to us helps us to understand those things.
Right. One of the keys of this is they call it the anthropomorphic understanding of God, right?
Yep, I got
An anthropomorphic, and you guys can help me out with this definition, but it's basically to say that God has hands or feet or whatever, or his arm is not too short. Those are ways of trying to understand God. He doesn't have an arm. He's spirit. He's light. That's the way I understand. but he doesn't have an arm or he's not this great grandfather in the sky with long gray hair or whatever. However, I do believe Christ we will see his wounds.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's confusing to me, but
Dr. Bookman phrases it this way.
He says,
someday when we all get to heaven, on the right hand of God, there will be a human who has been wounded for our transgressions.
Yeah.
And so when you get to know God in that way, that's an extraordinary thought. Yeah. Jesus, literally, as the human. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know. I think we will see those wounds, and we will see him as he is. But anyway, where was I going with all of that? This whole idea of anthropomorphic. So like wrath.
Yeah.
So is God up there just like chewing on a cigar and I'm mad at these humans, just really going to get them like a cartoon character of wrath?
Right.
It's like, no, but this is God's way of saying how much he hates sin. He uses a word that we understand, a very intense word, wrath.
Right.
And it's an intense, it's like it should bring fear to us to say, I know wrath from a human level, and I don't want to have a God level wrath. How do I get peace with this God, this wrath? And it's through Christ, and that satisfies the wrath of God.
And
that's right.
Go ahead. Well, and that's one of the things. And to go back and just to be nerdy for a second, the word that we're coming from is anthrop, which is just people. Morphic being, I think, change to or shape of. And it's a thing we do where we make something. Like if you think the Kool-Aid Man was an anthropomorphic picture of Kool-Aid, which is a Kool-Aid made to kind of look like a person so we can identify with it.
Yeah.
Which is what J. Packer talks about with the scripture, is they used anthropomorphic language, like a description of emotions and stuff like that, so that we could understand what they were talking about.
Right.
And so we could have some identification with it. But what he said is, if you go too far try to have him identify too much with us, then if you overhumanize God, then you're getting yourself in the problem when someone says, well, it says he's a jealous God, and that doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah.
It's like, that's because our jealousy is a petty green-eyed monster kind of jealousy. But when J. Packer talks about it, he talks about if you are married and you see your spouse kind of if someone's flirting with your spouse, there's a feeling you have, and that's not necessarily, and it can be petty and it can be misused, but there's an idea of, no, that is a special sacred relationship that I have with that person, and I want to protect that. Right. So there's this kind of divine version of these things that we have. So when he talks about like I said in Isaiah, and God saw that there was no justice in the world, and made him unhappy, and so he was going to lift up with his own hand to cause the salvation. He didn't use his hand, but we can understand that to be a part of himself in Jesus Christ.
That's right.
Is the kind of a human part of himself. But to say, well, I'm waiting to see God's hand come out of the ground to redeem us.
Well, but I want to go back to the jealous thing, because I think this is crucial. And when you understand the feeling of jealousy and the way you've described it, Casey, of unfaithfulness within a marriage, I mean, humanity understands that jealousy, right? We just do. And I think even people that they say they think they have these open marriages, I think they feel jealousy. Right?
They have to.
I know they do. I'm convinced of it.
Yeah.
That's how God's wired us. But anyway, and so it's like, and then you realize that's how God feels toward you when you put other things in front of him. That he's a jealous God. Yeah. He's jealous for your devotion and worship and allegiance, that we honor him.
That's right. And that's one of those wonderful things too, because every time J.I. Packer's getting back to, if you right-size God and you right-size yourself, everything begins to fall into place. That's the whole premise, I believe, of the book, In Knowing God. And I love how that comes out, especially because it speaks right at our generation. That book was written in 1973, but it's so apropos these 50 years later.
Yeah.
In 2023, as we look at the truth, the way Packer phrased it was, he says, there is nothing so irreligious as a self-absorbed religion.
Okay.
And a lot of times what we see today is people that are so self-absorbed. We often talk about Generation X and the millennial generation and a lot of those different things. And what you can see over the last quarter of a century or more is you can see that there has been a steady teaching at all levels, from the nursery all the way up till now, that in some ways you're the center of your universe.
Man, that's so true.
Therefore, your truth is the most relevant truth to you.
Yeah.
There is no truth external from you. It's just however you feel about it and so on.
Yeah.
And pretty soon you see that irreligion becomes something that is very destructive. And so when we step back from that, I don't care what age you're from, whether you are from the World War II generation all the way up till today, if we step back and we actually begin that passionate pursuit of knowing God, the pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer, or knowing God by J.I. Packer, they keep pointing at the same thing. If you'll pursue him, if you'll seek and try to search and know him,
Right.
something changes in you, and it's always good.
Right.
And I love that.
And then you realize when stuff happens to you that you don't understand, and some things are really, really hard, you realize, God is allowing things that he allows stuff to happen.
Yeah.
We have the choice to take that and cause that to be discipline for us. Cause it to be more, I can take my hardship and as discipline from the Lord, and he can make something beautiful come out of that. And it's like, it puts perspective to but that so many people get stuck. It's like, well, this bad thing happened. There's no God, or he doesn't care, and so I might as well do whatever I want to do.
Right.
It's like, oh no, you're missing the loop. He loves you deeply, and he's trying to show, how would a just and holy God show himself? He did that through Christ, but we see the words and we understand it. But it's like he's trying to show us. He's trying to tell us. He came to model it. He loves us deeply and passionately, and he's a big God, but he's not so big that he's going to come in and out of his and change free will. He's going to wait for you to submit to his goodness.
Well, I say this, Galen. One thing is abundantly clear. You could take months to delve into this beautiful, beautiful subject, and I guarantee you, when people come out, if they'll listen to everything that is being said, that they cannot help but come out and be closer to him.
Yeah.
And what that will do for their lives, for their children, for the culture around them, is going to be nothing less than miraculous.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden people will see a Christian as they ought to be, truly a little Christ, someone who's in passionate pursuit of him. I can't think of any higher topic that one could approach.
I totally agree with you, and we're going to end on that word right there. So as you go about your life, I hope that maybe you can delve into just knowing God. I think if you know God, it'll cause you to be strong and very courageous. God bless you guys.